Hi everyone, and thanks for joining in this class. My name is Anneli, and I'm going to talk to you about garden layout and how to plan for the garden season. Right now it's a beautiful March day, and we really all, I think, feel the itch to get out there and get working with our soils again. So I have been gardening full-time pretty much since 2008 when I first came to Maine. Me and my husband live on an off-the-grid, highly self-sufficient homestead where, among many other things, we grow and store pretty much all of our own food. So we're very busy in the summer and in the fall doing this, and in the winter we do take some off time, but we also spend quite a bit of time planning for the next season, because things like that can happen any time of the year, of course. So today we're going to do a sort of basic 101 garden planning class, and I'm going to talk to you about both the actual layout of a garden, but also how to think about what to grow and where to grow it, and what specific requirements that should go into the initial planning of the season. So first of all, I'm going to just talk a little bit about my garden, which is probably on a bigger scale than most home gardeners, yet on a much smaller scale than, say, a commercial farm. We have established our gardens throughout different years in the last 12 years or so that I've been here. And I draw up these basic maps, and it's pretty, I'm going to talk more about this, but generally the layout of my garden is a very symmetrical garden plan, where one of the most important requirements is that I can get to anywhere with a wheelbarrow. We haul a lot of compost and seaweed and different things in and out of there, so the accessibility is very important. So if you're just about to start your own garden and planning out how to sort of lay the beds out, that is a very good thing to bear in mind, is to be able to move around in your garden easily. We have certain areas that are permanent beds, where we have lined them with logs on the side. Would be pretty similar to what most people think of as a raised bed. And other areas are more open ground that we can sort of rearrange between the seasons. Say if we're going to grow potatoes, it's more appropriate to have like a big field sort of than narrower beds with logs on the side. There are also one garden is closer to the house that we stay in the summer, and one garden is closer to the house where we're in the winter. So when I plan which crops to grow where, the crops that are ready to be harvested in the summer, I grow in the garden which is closer to our summer house, and then the crops that are ready to be harvested in the fall, I then grow in the by the house that we live in the winter. It's easy to think when we plan the garden that, oh, it's not a biggie to run down over there to pick my green beans, or, you know, in the winter I can just go up there and pick the kale, it doesn't matter. But once you do that every day, it's easier and easier to think like, oh, I just want kale for my lunch, but it's just a little bit too far, and then you don't come around to pick it. There are also different areas within our garden where the conditions are different. There's corners or areas that are wetter and that gets more shade later in the fall when the sun sits on a lower angle. So that is also worth to consider when planning a garden, is is the conditions different? Are the conditions different throughout the year, or will it pretty much be equal? Like in the wet corner of my garden, I can't grow something that needs to be planted early in the spring, for example, because I know it's going to be too wet. And things that requires sun throughout a longer season, there's no point for me putting in the lower corner where it will be so much shade already in, say, September. I also think of the garden as different areas in terms of where to grow what. Like I have a big fence which can be utilized as a trellis for a lot of crops. That's like one area. So we have the wet corner, and then we have the fence, which is another area. And I also have beds that are sort of established as perennial beds for herbs that comes back every year. And we have a pretty big patch of asparagus, and that bed of course always stays as asparagus. And when I plan what to grow, there are some things that are more important, and the first one is the site itself and what conditions you have on that particular site. So these are some things that needs to be considered. First of all, it's the amount of sun. I find a lot of, maybe both new and old gardeners, but mostly new gardeners, being very optimistic about how much sun the garden actually gets. Most all vegetables requires full sun, and full sun means pretty much 8 hours of unrestricted sunshine for the whole growing season. So if you go out now and look, the sun is going to be very different than what it will be in July and August. Partly because the sun is on a different angle, but also one thing that people forget about is that all the trees that don't have leaves on them right now will actually have leaves on them within a few months or a few weeks almost, and then it will be a lot shadier in that particular area. So one can't just go out one day of the year and determine if there's a lot of sun or not in the garden. That is something that you need to observe for a whole season. Sun is fairly, in some ways it's easy to change. You can always make your clearing bigger, of course, by felling a few trees and then get more sun on your garden. I'm not saying that you can't grow any vegetables if you don't have full sun, but you need to consider what is suitable to get the most out of your hard-earned work. And it's also the microclimate, and with that it's, I mean things like maybe you grow your garden in front of a big south-facing wall, and that will be a lot warmer than out in a field, for example. My neighbor which is right down the road from me, she's much more exposed to the water, and there's really no point for her to grow tomatoes outside because that ocean breeze is just enough to not really get those tomatoes going. So microclimate can both be a limiting factor and a beneficial factor, and when planning where to put your garden, if that's what you're going to establish this year or what to grow, take a few minutes to consider if your spot has the cool breeze or the warm sort of sheltered area, or how you can sort of play along with that. It's also the fertility of the soil, even within the same garden. In my case, the fertility in one corner is actually pretty different, or at least was in the outset different than other corners. So the whole garden could be the same, and you can try to find a good place where the whole garden is the same, or you can sort of learn to work around your own conditions where part of the garden might have a different fertility, and over the years you can work on building that up But meanwhile, you can plant things there that don't require as much fertility as you would in other corners of your garden. Then it's also the space, like the actual square footage of your garden. Some crops, by the nature of them, requires more space. If you only have a small garden, then you sort of need to prioritize. Like you can grow corn in a small garden, but you won't get as much food from that because corn is very space consuming. And if you want to get more actual poundage per square foot, you might want to consider other crops. Then again, we have a very big garden and have found through the years that we sort of overproduced for a number of years. So because we were very frugal, we didn't grow things that took up a lot of space because we wanted to really max out the yield. But then when finding that the yield got too much, we could sort of splurge on this space and grow things that we could use some of our garden for things that didn't give us so much pound per square foot. And then it's whether you have a greenhouse or not, which is sort of like a microclimate on its own. If you have a greenhouse, you have like a whole different playground in what you can grow and what time of the season you can grow it. Another thing to consider is which goals you have with your garden. If you just want to grow like a simple summer garden, for example, something to go out and you want to pick a little bit for dinners in the summers, you want to make like a nice Sunday brunch with some veggies from your own plot throughout August, September. So that's one goal. Then maybe you want to store some food. You want to actually have some root crops to set aside for the winter, or you want to have garlic to eat or something like that. And another thing that goes along with the goals is if you want to have what I call treat. It could be like maybe you want to grow that jack-o'-lantern for Halloween, or you want to make some pickles, or you want to be able to make your own salsa. A friend of mine plants out her garden so that every fall she can make her own kimchi. She grows exactly what she needs. The Napa cabbage, the daikon radish, the garlic, and that's her goal with her garden. But to have that in mind helps you when planning, because maybe you don't care so much for what's going to happen there in the summer, but you really want to have those pumpkins for Thanksgiving, for example. And it's also a matter of not only the amount of time, but when you will have time to be in your garden. Some of us are really busy in the summer, so it makes more sense to grow a garden where the bulk of the food will be ready to harvest in the fall. Most of us here in Deer Isle are very busy in the summer, so we want to kind of push the season into the fall. Others are very busy in the fall, like school teachers, for example, and they have the summer off. And yet again, a lot of people aren't even in the same place in the summer as in the fall. They go back to wherever in, say, September. So to have a garden where you got a bunch of kale and cabbage and broccoli all being mature in October, it's just a total waste. So that is a very important factor, but also time, as in like, do you have time to be there every day? Like things that needs to be picked every day to make sense to grow, like green beans, zucchini, cucumbers. One lady told me that she doesn't really like to grow green beans because she doesn't want to have to tell her friends that she can't do blank and blank because she needs to pick her beans. And there's an absolutely valid reason not to grow a certain crop. If you don't want to be in your garden every day, then grow things that say only needs to be picked once. You can grow beautiful cabbage and carrots and beets and a lot of different things that requires very little attention on a regular day-to-day basis. All right, so that was sort of a quick run through about the different things to consider when planning a garden. And next I wanted to show you some about my layout and how even in the winter I can sort of start to plan out what to grow where. And I have made these sketches of my garden. I have 3 different areas, so I have 3 papers just like this, where I have the beds and the paths all marked out like this, and also here's a bed running along the fence, and I have labeled them with numbers, so it's easy for me to sort of count and know what I'm looking at. And that's the last one. And so what I do when I start to plan the garden is that I just simply fill out my plan in pencil, and then as I plant things, and then it's sort of like a set deal, I fill it out with a pen. And this is also what I use as a garden notebook, if you so will, where I fill out how much I've grown of something, what date I planted it, and that really makes planning easier for next year. So instead of having to figure out, say, how many tomatoes in a bed I can grow, I just know, because I can go back 1 or a couple of years, and I save all these, or at least for a number of years, so that I can reference back and see how much I've grown and where I've grown what. I just want to show you that having a plastic pocket is a really good thing, because things are going to get wet and dirty out there, and if I have it in a plastic folder, I can actually take it with me. So this is the tip from the coach. As you can see here on this paper, for example, since I plant my garlic in the fall, I've already filled out where the garlic is planted and how many of each of the different varieties that I grow. Some of the topic of crop rotation, because that is something that I get a lot of questions about, and most people, most gardeners, even if you're a new beginner, sort of knows in the back of your mind that there's something called crop rotation, but how much to put into it and how to do it is a little bit blurrier perhaps. Crop rotation basically means that you try to avoid to grow the same crop in the same space year after year. Part of that has to do with that certain crops tends to eat a certain range of nutrients from the soil. So if you grow the same crop year after year after year, the soil can get depleted from those specific nutrients. That is something that can be avoided, or at least sort of arrested by fertilizing, both throughout the season but also in the fall, and sort of build the soil back up again. And it's also, I think, a more important reason for the crop rotation is to deter pests. Some pests, they eat the plant, like potato bugs. They eat the potatoes and then they just sort of burrow down in the soil right where the potatoes were, and that's where they're going to start eating next season. So moving the potatoes is a way to, at least, you can't really fool a potato bug, but you can try by moving the potatoes elsewhere. Some gardeners swear by crop rotation. You would hear people say that that is the single most important thing you can do to your garden. I don't really agree with that. I think it's important depending on how difficult you make it for yourself to do the crop rotation. It's pretty easy if all your garden beds have the same conditions. They all have the same amount of sun, they all have the same amount of or the same size, the same fertility, those sort of things, then you can simply sort of have cards, right? And you just like switch them around. Like corn grew here, now it's going to grow here, and then I'm going to move the tomatoes up there, and then sort of like do that little loop year after year. I try my best to do crop rotation. I spend a fair amount of time trying to like plot the garden out so that they won't sort of be the same as last year or for too many years. But at the end, I have a lot of different conditions in my garden, and there's a lot of different factors, and I can drive myself crazy trying to like rearrange everything year after year. And I have to say that the best garden is the one that gets planted. So before you drive yourself crazy with crop rotation, put that aside and go out and plant your garden, because those crops are going to grow better than any that you try to rotate just for the sake of rotating. Alright, so the next thing I'm going to talk about are some space-saving techniques. So you can make the most out of whatever size garden you have. Even on a small garden, you'd be amazed how much you can actually glean from that. And I have some things to highlight right here about that. And the first thing is, of course, what we mean with yield. And yield equals the harvest. When we talk about how much yield we get from a certain square footage, the way I look at it is that it's only what's being harvested and put into use, say eating at some point, that counts for the yield. You can grow a lot of food in your garden, but if you, for one reason or another, because you have lack of time, because you don't like what you grew, because for whatever reason you don't harvest it or you don't eat it, it doesn't really count as a yield. So that is a very important factor, is to plan your garden so that you're gonna have time and desire to harvest and also to eat it. And the other really important, maybe the most important thing, is to have fertile soil. The amount of food you get out of any amount, blank square footage, 50 square feet for example, can vary drastically whether you have fertile soil or not. And it really comes with, I would say, the right conditions, not just the soil, but to grow the right crop for your conditions will be a huge factor in how much you're going to be able to harvest from that. So both the soil, but also things that we talked about before, if you have the right amount of sun or shade, or if you have a long enough growing season, all those things. This, with having fertile soil and sort of space-saving techniques, is not the same as crowding the plants. Crowding the plants, if a plant needs 2 feet or 3 feet to grow, it's not a space-saving technique to put them closer to each other. It's a very common new beginner mistake, one that I, after 12 years, still do. I still think of it as a new beginner mistake because I kind of wish that I wasn't a new beginner in this sense. But a lot of us have a tendency to plant things too close. Like the plant is only this big when we put it out in the garden. It just like looks so small. And it's hard to imagine that this little cabbage plant is going to grow to this size. You know, not just like the head, but with all the leaves and everything, it's going to want all that space. And by crowding it, you're going to lose the yield. That you're actually not going to get the same amount of cabbage. So you can sort of choose having like 5 tiny little scraggly looking cabbages, or you can have 3 that are really big and bold and beautiful. And another way to save space is, of course, to grow vertical. There's trellises. Everyone that has a garden should have a fence. Perhaps you can establish beds along the fence. There's this is like a whole different topic that I'm not going to get into, but you can also grow things in containers. You know, you can grow things on your porch, in the windowsills. There's a lot of ways to think beyond the little garden box that you have. And I do use the fence a lot, because every time I need to put up a trellis in my garden, it's work getting it up, it's work breaking it down, it blows over. The fences are more reliable. Then it's also succession planting. And with that, it basically means to use the same bed for more than one crop in a season. A lot of crops only takes a little bit of time in the spring, or they just need the fall to grow. So when planting it right, you can max out your space by planting, having several crops grow and be harvested from the same space. And I do have this sort of examples here of succession planting that I do in my garden. So one example is that in April, just about any day or soon any day, I will go out and I will plant my peas, my greens like the lettuce, the spinach, things like that, and my beets. And they will grow, and in pretty soon, in July, they will be ready to be pulled. The lettuce have bolted, spinach is getting tough, and planting beets that early in the season, they can grow throughout the whole season and be harvested in the fall. But if I can also plant some amount of beets and have for greens, or just like tiny little bulbs. So while those things are growing in my garden and being harvested, in June I start kale and broccoli in pots on my porch, and they will be ready in July. So when I have gone out and I pulled all those spring crops, because they have gone by anyways, there's no point leaving that bed open for the rest of the season. So instead I transplant this brassica. And brassica, for you who don't know that, is like the family name of kale, broccoli, cabbage, cauliflowers. There's a whole range of different varieties of brassica. So I grow one crop in April, I prepare the next crop in June outside of the garden, and in July I can utilize that space that otherwise would be left empty to grow out the fall brassica. Then in early July, I usually used 4th of July as like a reminder, I start Chinese cabbage and rutabaga in pots on my porch. They grow beautifully, they're safe from pests, I can tend to them, it's easy to sort of keep an eye on these tiny little baby plants when they're right there in front of me every day. In early August, I go out and I harvest my garlic. I grow a lot of garlic, so the space in my garden that would be left empty is pretty vast. It's very high value space that would be empty from August all through the season, and instead I can then transplant my Chinese cabbage and rutabaga. Those crops don't want to grow in the summer anyways. They don't suffer, they don't do very well in August heat, but in September, October, they're gonna go bonkers out there in the garden. So I use the garlic plot to grow my fall brassica. And then in August comes the times to harvest those early potatoes. Oh, what a treat they are at that time. Suddenly I have a whole other vast amount of space empty, and that is a perfect time to plant things like short season turnips, radish and spinach. Also crops that don't do well at all in the heat, but they will take one frost after another. So they are perfect to plant then, and you will have spinach and radish long into the fall. So these are some ways to sort of play around. If you have time, and if you're around in the fall, these are great ways to maximize the little space of garden you might have. And then the last factor in how to max out your yield is interplanting. I have sort of played around with that and experimented with growing like different crops in the same bed, and I have had varied success. Timing is of essence. One pretty popular concept of interplanting is what is referred to as the Three Sisters garden, where you grow your corn and you grow your beans, and the beans will sort of climb up the corn, and then underneath you grow your squash. Now this is all fine and dandy if you get the timing right, so that the corn sort of gets a start, so that the beans have something to grow on when they come, and then that the squash won't just totally sort of disappear in all this. My experience, and maybe I just didn't give myself enough time to build experience around this, my very lean experience was that the beans kind of grew very tall before they started to have anything to climb on. Then the raccoon came and tore down the corn, so that the beans just like ended up in this mess, and the squash took over everything and now couldn't even walk in there to get the corn. It got pretty messy. So I have sort of resolved to grow corn, and on the ground I grow squash. That's sort of messy enough, you know, without even like throwing the beans in there. Worth considering when doing any amount of interplanting is then the amount of shade that something is going to get. Certain squash varieties deal with shadier conditions better, and there will be shade under the corn. I know the corn is only this big, maybe when you go out and plant your squash, but they're going to grow very big, and they're going to be a lot of shade on your squash. Other ways to interplant is to actually make use of that shade. You can grow your tomatoes, and then in the summer you can grow lettuce, for example, behind the tomatoes, because lettuce wants the shade in August, for example. Lettuce, don't even try to grow it in full sun in August, but you can grow it in the shade of taller plants, and you will actually get a pretty decent crop. And if nothing else is going to grow there, all you got to lose is a few sprinkles of lettuce seeds. Alright, so I have drawn up a quick sketch here of a sort of mock-up garden. You can think of this as raised beds or garden beds, or whichever beds, 4 by 12 feet. And I'm just going to go through like one very basic garden planting, and then another one which is more lean towards those who want to grow more food in the fall. Okay, so I'm going to show you just a sort of basic garden layout, how it can be. Most of what I'm going to show you are crops that will be ready to harvest in the summer. So this is for the person that want to have like a summer garden, pick a little bit every day or most days, and maybe even have some in the fall. So these are meant to be 4 by 12 feet, these beds. And in the first bed, there's a trellis there with peas. And here are some early broccoli that will be, you know, you plant them out in April, or you plant them out in the end of May, and you will have broccoli towards the end of July if you grow a short season variety. There's also the lettuce and the spinach, and some herbs like basil and parsley. And the one thing to consider with this is both that the broccoli will need quite a bit of space, and that the peas, they will actually be, even though you grow them upright on a trellis, there will be a fair amount of shade in front of the peas. So don't plant your lettuce right up against the trellis. Next bed, put in 5 plants of tomatoes for a home gardener. Just want to eat through the summer. That could be more than you want, so you leave yourself with some pounds to turn into salsa, for example, and you can preserve it. The squash here I put towards the end of the bed because you can train the vines to grow out over the edge. They don't have to take up almost any room at all in your actual garden bed. Next bed, a couple of rows of green beans, either as bush varieties or you can put up a trellis. If you put up a trellis, you probably can only grow one row of them because otherwise it will be shade towards the back one. And also a row of cucumber here. Now this is about 8 feet of cucumber, and for the home gardener, this is probably all you want, and with leftovers to pickles. And a zucchini plant. We all know that zucchini will yield more than most people want, so one goes a long way. And once again, you can plant it towards the end and sort of push it out towards the edge there. This last bed, put some carrots and beets in here. You know, they can be eaten through the summer as little baby things, or they can be thinned out and given more space and then harvested in the fall. Here I put onion or leeks or garlic, or you can maybe do onion and leeks, but once you put the garlic in it, it's sort of like its own thing. So maybe for someone that has more time in the fall, there's some things that could be rearranged here. You can, for example, you can grow out your peas and your lettuce and your spinach, and then, as I mentioned earlier, you can harvest that, sort of clear the space in July, and if you have prepared, you can plant out fall crops like brassica or fall crops like broccoli or cabbage, for example. Otherwise, if you don't, you just don't want to go through this in the summer at all, then just forget about that and plant your fall greens right away. Like, for example, you can grow more of your cabbage, like long season cabbage that will take the whole summer. You can grow a couple of rows of Swiss chard, for example. They will just stand there through the summer until you're ready for it in the fall. So I just put in cabbage and chard here, for example. And those are just beautiful fall crops that won't require much attention at all in the summer. And perhaps 5 tomatoes or more do you want to deal with in the heat of the summer. So just take 3 of those out. 2 plants will get you a long ways. Everyone has time to run out to the garden and harvest a few for your lunchbox every morning, even if you don't have time to do anything else in your garden. For example, then you can add another squash. They won't be ready anyways until late in the fall. They will just be there. So that's a perfect sort of solution for the fall gardener. Green beans and cukes requires being out there every day to pick them, or at least every 2 days. The yield will drastically decrease if they're not picked regularly. So for someone that don't want to go through that, just like say, forget about it. I'm not dealing with green beans. I got a life to live, damn it. So instead, why not just put in a few rows of kale? Kale, and say we do some Brussels sprouts here. These crops is what I consider very late fall, early winter crops. I don't even start to pick my kale or Brussels sprouts until they have had a good solid freeze. People go out there and pick their kale in August. I just wonder what they're thinking. And some people claim they don't like Brussels sprouts. Let's pray for them. They have just not had the right kind of Brussels sprouts. They should have a solid freeze before they're being picked. So this is a perfect example for those who are busy in the summer. There are years where I go out and dig my kale out from under the snow or my Brussels sprouts, and they are just outstanding. They can take pretty much anything. And all these crops will do absolutely fine through the summer on their own. Plant them in, forget about them. Come back in October, other than the garlic. Disclaimer about the garlic, you need to pick your garlic, right, in summer. Everything else will do fine through the summer. Come back in October, November, whenever you have recovered from whatever you did in the summer. Pick it, store it in your basement or whatever you got, and you will enjoy this through the winter. Alright folks, before I let you all go out there to your gardens, I just wanted to show you some of the reference books that I'm using, and two of my closest companions in this are the seed catalogs. I use Fedco Seed Company. It's a Maine-based seed co-op for most of my seed ordering. And they have this lovely catalog, which I highly recommend, if nothing else, just for the fun of reading it. But it also has a lot of information about the different crops, and they do have different planting guides. Best of all though for planting guides is actually Johnny's seed catalog. This is worth hanging on to. If you get one year, then just hang on to the catalog, because most likely your plants are going to want the same distance and conditions next year. And I use this even year after year as just like a refresher on how much space my cabbage needs, how much space did the celeriac want again, and when to transplant the peppers and things like that. So both these, even at this time of the year when you have ordered your seeds, I believe you can still request these catalogs from the companies, and you will probably get a lot of use out of them. This is another book that, this is sort of like the Garden Bible. You can see just how big it is, by Barbara Damrosch, who lives here in the same area as I do. And she has written this garden primer, and boy, that has just about everything you need, from perennials to vegetables, bulbs, lawn, fruit, trees. This is amazing. And then the other book that I'm using a lot is Will Bonso's Essential Guide to Radical Self-Reliant Gardening. Will has been homesteading up in Western Maine for just about ever, and he is not only a wealth of knowledge, but he has a wit and a humor that is well worth the read. I mean, even if you're not even into gardening, you should still read his book just for the absolute joy of reading his take on homesteading and living in general. So with that being said, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact IHT, and they will happily direct your questions to me. And best of luck, and know that nothing is as forgiving as a garden. If you fail with something this year, there will always be another year to try again. So yeah, best of luck and enjoy this season. Thank you so much.